Today I want to go back in time to June 13th, 1843, here in Istanbul, which back then was still officially known as Constantinople. It was the capital of the Ottoman Empire. And just about a block from where I am right now, I'm in a beautiful hotel overlooking sunrise, basically, on the Bosphorus River. And about a block from where I am is a place called Dolmabahce Palace. And on June 13th, 1843, the Sultan, the head of the Ottoman Empire at the time, his name was Sultan Abdülmecid, he ordered the construction of this new palace. And this was supposed to be a palace of opulent luxury and splendor that the world had never before seen. He was looking for a symbol. He was looking for a symbol of greatness. Because at the time, the Ottoman Empire was in terminal decline, and everybody knew it. This was the mid-1800s. At this point, Britain was far and away the biggest, the biggest power, not only in Europe, but in the world. Now, you remember that the Ottoman Empire, really for more than a century, had been the world's dominant superpower. Now, if you think about the shift of wealth and power in the world, the Roman Empire had actually moved its capital in the early 300s AD from Rome to Constantinople, and Constantinople eventually became the seat of the entire Roman Empire. They actually they ultimately stopped speaking Latin, and they started speaking Greek in Constantinople. And Constantinople was essentially the world's capital when it was the capital of the Roman Empire. It was eventually conquered and sacked, and not only did the Western Roman Empire fall, but even the Eastern Roman Empire eventually fell. And after it was conquered and sacked over and over and again, Europeans kept coming in and sacking Constantinople. The Latin Empire was here for a while. Constantinople was actually, it became just a satellite state of Greece for a while. And eventually it was conquered once again by the Ottomans. And the Ottomans made Constantinople their capital city. So really Constantinople was sort of the world capital, not once, but twice, once under the Romans and once under the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottomans conquered it, the Ottoman Empire became the dominant superpower in the world. And this was in the mid-1400s, into the 1500s, and so forth, at a time when they were unstoppable. In fact, the Europeans were terrified of the Ottomans. There were several epic battles between the Ottoman Empire and various European kingdoms. They tried to sack Vienna, and all these European powers had to come together to try and stop these invading Asians, the Eastern question. This was a really interesting time in Europe, and the Ottomans were far and away this dominant superpower, but they lost it, and they lost it for so many different reasons. Frankly, their own stupidity was the thing that contributed the most. At a time, for example, when the printing press was the dominant social technology in Europe, when Gutenberg invented this movable type printing press and suddenly created conditions for the flourishing of knowledge and education all across Europe, which sparked things like the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. There was an enlightenment and scientific discovery and all these things made possible by this social technology. The Ottomans outlawed it. They banned it. They thought it was, some newfangled, heretical contraption. They didn't want anything to do with it, and everything had to be state-controlled and highly bureaucratic. In fact, the Ottomans were famous for their bureaucracy. The Ottomans they had a system where it became quite clear that all these government functionaries and bureaucrats clearly believed that the people existed to support their position, and not that their position existed to support the people. It was at this point that they were clearly doomed. It was quite interesting. There's a great story that when Sir Isaac Newton died in London, he was buried with full honors. He was buried with the honors of a king. And there was an Ottoman dignitary who was visiting London at the time and was watching this funeral procession where they had horses and carriages and all the heraldry you can imagine in the way that one would bury a king. And this person was an academic, and this Ottoman dignitary couldn't believe it, that somebody who was just nothing but an academic, just a scientist, they just didn't have any regard or respect for somebody whose sole mission in life, sole purpose in life was to be an intellectual. The Ottomans couldn't believe that somebody like that would be buried with the same dignity as a king. And that pretty much tells you everything that you need to know. They were averse to technology, they were averse to intellectual growth, and it was all about creating this huge bureaucracy that a few people benefited from and everybody else suffered from. By the mid-1800s, the Ottoman Empire was known as the sick man of Europe, in fact, and all of the decisions that they had made had really taken its toll. Europe and all these European nations who were a couple of hundred years ago quivering in terror, just horrified at the approaching Ottoman Empire and that everybody was going to get taken over, and they were so terrified of this, now had completely leapfrogged. They were light years ahead of the Ottoman Empire. And now the Ottoman Empire was going around with hat in hand trying to borrow money from these European nations that they were once threatening to conquer everybody, and now they were practically broke. They were in terminal decline. They were debasing their currency. They were really trying to get their act together. They're trying to create any reform possible. They were going saying, wow, the Europeans really leapfrogged us. What are these guys doing that we weren't doing? Let's go and try and impose some new reforms. But you got to put that in the too little too late category, because everything that they tried really in the 1800s to reform, it just didn't work. It was too little too late. They had their chance in the 1600s and the 1700s and so forth, and they never took it. They waited until it was too late to try and reform the system. And in the mid-1800s, they realized that this moniker being the sick man of Europe, that was something they didn't really care for. So they wanted to go out there and show the world that they still had what it took. They wanted to show the world that they were still a dominant power. And on June 13th, 1843, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire ordered the construction of this new palace. He wanted to create a symbol, and that's what the palace was. It was a symbol of how powerful and wealthy the Ottoman Empire really was. Now, of course, they weren't wealthy and powerful at all. In fact, they had to go heavily into debt and borrow a bunch of money just to build this new palace. And it was a palace. It wasn't like they were building even anything that could be regarded as infrastructure, or something that would actually improve the economy, something that would actually increase productivity and trade. No, it was something that was just a handful of guys we were going to get to use. As everybody else, the entire country, the entire empire essentially goes deeper into debt. They have to divert a huge portion of their tax revenue so that a single family and their harem and concubines and so forth can live in the lap of luxury. And they wanted to build this thing, so that even the French, with their Versailles, and even the British with their Buckingham Palace, that all these huge and powerful monarchies out there, all these huge and powerful nations would be jealous, would be envious of the splendor of this new palace in the Ottoman Empire, and show the world that they were once again, powerful and wealthy. What a foolish thing to do. And on June 13th, 1843, they began construction. And I can see it right here. There's the mosque and the palace grounds and so forth. It's just right out my window here, and it's certainly very nice. It's very pretty. Beautiful construction. They turned it all into a museum. We actually went down there yesterday with some friends. I'm here taking a couple of days off after we spent 5 days at our annual entrepreneurship camp, and it's pretty intense affair. And after that, we always try and take a couple of days off just to recover. And I love it here. I love Istanbul. This place, again, having been sort of the world's major capital 2 times in its lifespan, and it's still just a beautiful place. It's absolutely incredible. There's so much history here. And, it's that place that shows that things change. It was the civilization. You look at the capital of civilization being Rome, and it eventually shifted to the east, and it shifted to here to Constantinople, and eventually continued to shift east and into the Mongolian Empire and the Ming Dynasty, and essentially China, which for a while it continued that shift east, and China was the dominant superpower in the world. And then it started to shift back to the west, back to the Ottoman Empire, and then back to Spain, and then France, and then Britain, and so forth. That all these different empires essentially had their time being the top dominant superpower in the world. And the Ottoman Empire was certainly one of those. And again, here in Constantinople, which saw 2 times in 2 different dynasties, 2 different empires ruling the world from right here in Constantinople. And when the Ottoman Empire, by the mid-1800s, was no longer the dominant superpower in the world. In fact, they had been surpassed by the Spanish, and then the French, and then the British. And they were so desperate to show the world that they were still powerful that they did something insanely stupid. In fact, this thing that they did that was insanely stupid ended up contributing to their own now economic demise, because now the Ottomans had to go deeply into debt. They had to go around and borrow from the Europeans. It got worse with the outbreak of the Crimean War. They had to go and borrow money from, in many cases, even the very countries, banks from the very countries that they would have to fight later. And it got to the point where the debt burden in the Ottoman Empire was so great that by the 1870s, they were spending 50% of their tax revenue just to pay interest on the debt. It's an astounding figure. 50% of all the money they took in. And tax rates kept going up. They had this I could say actually Byzantine, with pun intended, tax system in which it was so complicated and so obtuse and nobody understood it, and yet it was incredibly extractive. People would just in fear of the tax farmers who would go out and basically extract everything that they could, and tax rates kept going up, and even still they were spending half of their tax revenue just to pay interest on the debt. And so much of that was going out the door to foreign governments and so forth that had loaned them money. And after that, they were finished. And the Ottoman Empire essentially defaulted on its debt. They clung around for a few more decades after that. In fact, participated in World War I. That was probably their last ditch effort to try and make something of themselves. They partnered up with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire to fight against the Brits and eventually the Americans who joined the fight, and the French and so forth. And after World War I, the Ottoman Empire essentially just ceased to exist anymore. It just went away, and it doesn't even exist anymore. And of course, it was replaced by Turkey today. This republic, which has its own issues and challenges. I will say, for anybody that's kind of an emerging markets, developing market speculator, the Turkish lira right now has actually never been this cheap in its entire history. There are always very interesting opportunities when we look around the world. We can see in Indonesia and South Africa and Colombia and here in Turkey some very, very interesting opportunities. And I think anybody that has a long-term view of looking at some of these developing countries, particularly if you have U.S. dollars to spend, the dollar hasn't been this strong in more than a decade. The lira hasn't been this weak ever in its history. That's kind of a good long-term play. You generally do fairly well over the long term as an investor if you sell what's expensive and you buy what's cheap. But that's neither here nor there. It's the overall point is that these things change, and dominant superpowers rise, they peak, they decline, and they fall. In fact, the Ottoman Empire went through all four of those seasons. It came out of nowhere, and it rose to prominence, and it peaked, and it started a terminal decline based on its own complete and utter stupidity, building these massive bureaucracies and taxing people and keeping technological progress out, essentially thwarting technological progress because of a massive system of regulation. It was government regulators, it was government bureaucrats that were going around keeping all of the new technology and all these things out, preventing people from being able to progress and produce. And eventually, it literally ended. We're not even talking about declining and falling. We're talking about just ending. It doesn't even exist anymore. These things happen, and honestly, it's foolish. That when you look at the course of history and see that so many other countries and so many other empires went and took its place, and now there happens to be a different empire that's taken the place and is now in sort of peak position, dominating the world, and to think that these same sorts of things just can't happen to other people. Nobody ever thinks that it's going to happen to them. When the French were the dominant superpower in the world, of course the French thought that they were going to be entitled to that position forever. And then the British took over, and the British thought that they were going to be entitled to that position forever. And then the Americans took over, and of course the Americans think that they're going to be entitled to that position forever. And they're not. Because the United States is in many ways very similar in its position to the Ottoman Empire, where they're having to borrow money just to pay interest on the money they've already borrowed. They've sort of dug their own graves. The government's dug its own grave based on its own stupidity. Decades and decades of completely insane financial decisions that they've made, going out and waging costly, never-ending wars that they can't finance. They have to borrow money and indebt future generations just to pay, for things that have no positive outcome whatsoever. This is the sort of thing that's been happening in the United States for decades. And they're in this position now where they have to borrow money just to pay interest on the money they've already borrowed, where you look at these, mandatory entitlement programs, you're looking at the amount of money that they paid just to cover interest on the debt, in the United States, it's almost at the point now where they're exceeding the amount of money that they spend on defense just to pay interest on the debt. If you look at interest on the debt, in addition to mandatory entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, just these programs alone are almost exceeding the entirety of their tax revenue. I mean, it's as if you could essentially eliminate every single department of government. Just imagine waving your finger and tomorrow they're no longer being a Department of Energy. They're no longer being a military. They're no longer being an FBI, Homeland Security, or they're no longer being an EPA to dump chemical toxins in a river and turn it brown. They're no longer being any of these agencies at all. And all you keep is the mandatory stuff. All you keep is the debt and the Social Security, and you still don't make a dent in paying down the debt. That's how bad the situation is in the United States. And if you look at it from a real context, and again, these this isn't some wild and crazy assertion by Simon Black. Their own numbers tell us this. Every single year, the United States publishes its own financial statements. Every month, the Treasury publishes its own financial statements. You can see for yourself, looking up the financial statements of the United States government, their own estimation of their net worth. If you look up all the assets, their cash position, the highway system, every tank, every bullet, every desk chair, the president's airplane, all these things, and you add up all the assets, and then you subtract the liabilities and just the official liabilities, what they owe to, what they owe to taxpayers in the form of debt, in the form of bonds, what they owe to China, what they owe to the Federal Reserve, what they owe to banks, what they owe to all these people, and you add up all the liabilities. The net result, the net worth of the federal government of the United States is negative $17.7 trillion. And it gets worse every single year. This is something that they cannot grow their way out of. And oh, by the way, that's not even the worst part. Because their own estimations of the things that they don't even count as debt, they have what they call off-balance sheet liabilities. It's a convenient way of saying that, there's certain liabilities that they hold, certain obligations that they have that they don't have to count. If you or I run a business, we're required by law to count these obligations. The government doesn't have to, but they still make a certain calculation, and their own calculation shows, for example, that Social Security and Medicare, these are what they call these unfunded Social Security and Medicare liabilities, the unfunded obligations that they owe to taxpayers down the road, total $42 trillion. $42 trillion that they owe taxpayers. These are obligations they have to anybody that's paying into the Social Security system over the next several decades. They don't have $42 trillion. They don't have anywhere near $42 trillion. This is $42 trillion that they owe the taxpayers of the United States. It's more than 20 times, it's over 30 times what they owe the Chinese. It's orders of magnitude more than what they owe the Federal Reserve. It's more than what they owe anybody, $42 trillion. And so they're in the hole by $17.7 trillion before they even count these unfunded liabilities of Social Security. If you add it all together, you're talking $60 trillion that they're in the hole, a negative net worth of $60 trillion. It doesn't matter who becomes president of the United States at that point. It doesn't matter at all. These contests every 4 years, they're just a joke. It's like going to a circus. It's just call it what it is. It's entertainment. It's a bunch of people, saying a bunch of things, talking out of their asses about things that just don't even matter, because the only thing that matters is the $60 trillion that the country's in the hole. You don't grow your way out of $60 trillion. How are you going to grow your way out? Just do the math. The GDP of the United States, even if you accept their own monkey numbers, $16-17 trillion, the government's share of that in tax revenue is less than 20%. Now, when you're talking about having $60 trillion in negative net worth from the U.S. government, you're taking maybe 17% of $16.5 trillion. You're talking decades and decades and decades of allocating your entire tax revenue to doing nothing but paying your obligations. It just doesn't work. Just do the math. It's so simple. A fourth grader could do this math. It doesn't work. It doesn't compute. It's just not possible. They have to default on somebody. They either have to default on the $1.2 trillion that they owe the Chinese, or they have to default on the $2.4 trillion they owe the Federal Reserve, or they have to default on the $10+ trillion that they owe, anybody else that's holding on to U.S. government treasuries, or they have to default on the $42 trillion they owe that they owe to Social Security recipients, past, present, and future. Somebody is getting defaulted on. These obligations are not going to be maintained. These obligations are not going to be adhered to. They will break their promises. It's simply not possible mathematically to maintain these promises. That's it. And so when you're in that position, it doesn't matter. It's pick your metaphor. It's rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It really doesn't matter. It's great for entertainment purposes. It's great to get people together and make them feel inspired and happy and that there's hope and so forth. But that's all it is. It's just words. And every 4 years, people continue to allow themselves to be deluded and lied to by the same cadre of people over and over again. Oh, look, it's a Bush. Oh, look, it's a Clinton. And then we're going to be lied to again and again and again by the same group of people who either aren't smart enough to understand the situation or they're happy to just lie to your face. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in right now. I have this theory about politicians and political history of the United States. I think it's interesting, and I'm going to tell you about it. Basically, my view is that every election cycle, essentially, the American voters are so sick of the current guy that they just swing in the exact opposite direction. When you think about Barack Obama, people were so sick and tired of George W. Bush. They were tired of the war. They were tired of this kind of crazy cowboy mentality. He would ask his gut and go off and wage war because his gut told him to do things. They were just so tired of that and sort of this serial. The guy couldn't string a sentence together without sounding like a baboon. Barack Obama was sort of the exact opposite of that. He was this younger guy, suave, cool. He could shoot a three-pointer. All these cool things. Barack Obama was sort of the exact opposite of George W. Bush. But remember when George W. Bush came in, he was sort of the exact opposite of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was this loose-moraled guy, cheated on his wife, doing all these crazy things. And George W. Bush was this, hardcore conservative guy from Texas and all these things. He sort of constituted the opposite of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, of course, was the exact opposite of George H.W. Bush, / Reagan. You had 12 years of, Reagan Bush with these old school, Washington insider conservative guys. And now here comes this young guy from Arkansas, who's really sort of the exact opposite of George H.W. Bush and Reagan. And of course, Reagan was the exact opposite of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was, this guy who just, look at all the mess that he got people into, and he was this inexperienced guy. And here Reagan represents strength, and Reagan represents, morning in America. He's the exact opposite of Carter. And of course, Carter represented the exact opposite of everything that the country had been through with Nixon and Ford. He represented the exact opposite. He was a breath of fresh air and none of this, Washington insider nonsense anymore where we've got corrupt politicians and so forth. And Carter was the exact opposite. And, you can kind of walk the dog and go all the way back to this every single time there's an election. And voters in the United States just swing in the exact opposite direction. Who do you think represents the exact opposite of Barack Obama? Donald Trump. And, he may or may not win, but in my opinion, that's why this guy is so popular. He's so popular because he constitutes the exact opposite of Barack Obama. And not even just Obama, but almost the exact opposite of all political candidates. And I think that Americans are at the point now where they're so fed up that they're looking for something, anything, that's not part of that process anymore. And it's not even that they're so fed up with Obama, they're fed up with politicians and government in general. And Trump represents the exact opposite of that. He represents the opposite of that traditional political ethos. And I think that's why he's so, he's so popular with these, with this group of people. I got a really interesting, I would even almost say disturbing email from a close friend of mine who forwarded me an email from another friend of his who's writing about essentially what's happening where he's living in Michigan, and he's writing about all these, these firearms, weapons dealers, basically, who are running, retail weapons outlets, where the people in the public can go and buy firearms and so forth. Talk about these places that, their businesses have blown up so much That's probably a bad word to use. Their businesses have grown so much, over the last couple of years. One group, they're moving from 1,000 square foot retail space to a 25,000 square foot space. And it's not just them. Everybody's doing it. Everybody's growing. Everybody's expanding, simply because there's so many, individual Americans saying, you know what, I'm going to buy a weapon. And they're not, we're not talking about even, some little 9mm or something like that. We're talking about, big automatic assault rifles. And these are middle class Americans. These are people that are accountants and lawyers and teachers and anybody else that are out there in the middle class. They're seeing their standard of living deteriorate. They're seeing their country change right before their very eyes, and they're scared. And so they're going and they're doing something about it. And what they're doing about it is they're going and buying firearms. And you have to imagine that, again, middle-class, traditional-minded American people wouldn't go out and spend, $1,000 or a couple $1,000s on automatic rifles and ammunition if they thought that there would be absolutely no need to ever use them ever. These are practical people. These aren't nutcases that are going out and building a wall and preparing for the end of the world. These are rational people. And rational people now are going and spending thousands of dollars on automatic assault rifles and ammunition. And they're looking at it, they're looking at the government building up a huge arsenal of even more automatic assault rifles and ammunition and arming everybody to the teeth. The Fish and Wildlife Service has its own police force now with automatic assault rifles going and, kicking in people's doors and throwing them to the ground because of some obscure violation of some regulation. That's what freedom means today in the United States. That's what it is. That's your taste of liberty in the United States of America, in the land of the free. Is that there are dozens and dozens, hundreds really, of police agencies at the local, state, and federal level that have the power to, go around and kick in doors and freeze you out of your assets and all these things because of some obscure violation of a regulation that you've never heard of. And if you just get on the wrong list of some government bureaucracy, they're going to throw the book at you. You ever notice now in courts? Nobody ever gets brought up on a single charge. And if you get brought up, that's how it used to work. If somebody violated the law, they get brought up on a charge. They'd go to court. You were innocent until proven guilty. A jury of your peers would decide whether or not you were innocent or guilty, and then you would be judged and potentially sentenced accordingly. Now it's not. That's not it at all. Now it's not about whether or not you're doing anything wrong. It's whether or not you end up on somebody's list, whether or not they like you. And if you get on the wrong side of somebody's list and some bureaucrat somewhere, some agency decides they don't like you, then it's not about whether or not you've done anything wrong. It's about finding something, anything that they can stick you with. So they go out and they'll bring you up on 37 different counts of some obscure regulation that you haven't heard of. And they put you up in front of a jury that's not of your peers. And they put you up in front of a bunch of strangers. And the entire trial is to make you look like a bad person. People go, well, they brought them up, they bring up on charges, 37 different counts of 37 different charges of this, that, and the other. He must have done something wrong, and that's how people get convicted these days. It's all about it has nothing to do with whether or not you did anything wrong or immoral. It's just about finding people that they don't like and coming up with every possible violation of the book. And as you listen to this right now, I can guarantee that you're guilty of something. Anything. There's so many things that you've never even heard of. There are probably 6 or 7 things right now that you're doing wrong. If you've unlocked your phone, you're in violation of a whole series of regulations that you've never heard of. All kinds of things. That's what liberty means now in the United States. And I think people realize that, and they're so tired of it. They're so sick of it. And they're going out and taking matters into their own hands, literally in their hands, with firearms and ammunition. This is what the mentality is now. And so, of course, people are so disgusted by the political process. They're so disgusted by the same old people saying, yeah, we're going to be great and all these things. And, it's just the same crap over and over again. And so I guess honestly, I think they're all dangerous. I think they're all ignorant. I think they're all spewing the same stuff over and over again. But I understand why Trump is so popular. Because if you follow back, if you kind of look at this theory of the American voters swinging the exact opposite direction, this is what they're doing. Trump is the exact opposite of Barack Obama, and he constitutes the exact opposite of the entire political process. And I think that's really what people are looking for. The problem is that The answers are not in the political process. It's not government that solves these problems. Government is not the solution. Government is the problem masquerading as the solution. And what's so dangerous is that every 4 years, voters continue to allow themselves to be deluded into this fantasy that as long as we just got to get the right guy. If we just get the right guy or girl, I mean, come on, we just get the right person in office. That's all that matters. And that's what everybody said about Obama. It was just all this hope and change and all this, it's just the same stuff. It's always change, change, change. Yeah, it's always change. You ever notice how change never matters? Nothing ever changes. It's always the same stuff. Obama's supposed to represent all this change, and then, who did he pick as his Treasury Secretary? The guy who was the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. How has that changed? Who did he pick as his Secretary of State? Somebody who had been on the, a Washington insider, for 8 years. I mean, just look at these cabinet positions, and everything is the same. Who did he pick as Defense Secretary? The guy who was Defense Secretary under George W. Bush. How has that changed? There's no change. Change would have been, hey, I think the Department of Energy is utterly worthless. I'm not even going to nominate anybody for Secretary of Energy because it's a pointless position. Let's get rid of the department altogether. That would have been change, But you didn't get that. You just got the same old crap. It's just a different, it's just different suits walking around. That's all it was. Nothing ever changes. People realize that over the course of people's terms. But then all of a sudden, you get an election year run around, people go, oh, we just got to get the right person in there. And people actually invest themselves in this process. They go out and they put stupid signs in their yards and bumper stickers and, maybe even hold debates with their neighbors. And they make phone calls and, volunteering their time to go out and, and campaign for people, even though nothing's going to change. Because it never changes. And this isn't a pessimistic statement. I'm actually incredibly optimistic. I'm optimistic for the entire world. I'm optimistic for the individual who recognizes reality and actually takes steps to do something about it. Thousands of years ago, human beings pooled themselves into collectives. Families became tribes, and they had tribal leaders and so forth. And as tribes got bigger and bigger, they kind of morphed into kingdoms. And as kingdoms got bigger and bigger, they morphed into empires, like the Ottoman Empire, like the Habsburg Empire, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And as these empires sort of rose and peaked and declined, every now and again there would be a major change in the social construct. I mean, the feudal system is a classic example of that, where everything was all about one person. You had the king at the top, or maybe the emperor, and everybody else was there to support him. You had all these serfs at the bottom who rose and worked every day to support the emperor and pay everything to the emperor, and they got some little breadcrumbs that were left over. What a ridiculous system that was. And of course, over time, based on a confluence of a number of circumstances, war, the plague, all these things, eventually that system broke and it fell and it was replaced by something else. And now, that turned into, the feudal system. Eventually, the final nail in the coffin of the feudal system was the Industrial Revolution. It was technology that brought people out of that system. It was technology that caused a decline and massive change in the prevailing social contract and the way that the society organized itself. It was the Industrial Revolution. It was the ability now for people to let machines do a lot of work. It was the ability for people to generate significant wealth, the rise of the middle class that came out of the Industrial Revolution. That's what caused, this change. I'm actually reading this really interesting book about these personal stories during the Industrial Revolution about the rise of the working class, the rise of the middle class, and really how much better off people were. You read a lot of socialist literature. We see this in history books about, the Industrial Revolution was a great opportunity for workers to get exploited. That's utter bullshit. The Industrial Revolution was a time where workers' standards of living improved dramatically, and that anybody that had the sense enough to develop a real skill had a great life and found themselves and this is primary source data. This isn't Simon Black's conjecture. This is actual real data that anybody can go and look at, and it's a great story about how the rise of technology changed the social contract, and people now had more freedom, they had more opportunity, they had greater wealth, and it was something that had really never been before seen. This is what drives change. Real change comes from the individual. Real change comes from technology, not from politicians. It comes from intellectual ingenuity, the rise of technology, the rise of the individual. And that's the opportunity that we have right now. Politicians don't create these solutions. They create the problems. They create the debt. They create the war. They create the problems that human beings have to go and rise up and overcome. And we're in the same phase that we were when the Industrial Revolution kicked off, where now there's this massive change in technology. In this technology, now we've entered the digital age. And upon entering the digital age, now we have so many more opportunities than we ever had before, and it's changing the way that society is organized. Geography is now no longer relevant. In 2015, you can live where you want to live, you can work when you want to work, you can earn money from anywhere in the world, you can have relationships with people that you've never even met in the flesh who live on the other side of the planet. You can choose to live in a place that isn't, the same country where you were born or the same country where you have a passport from. Or you can even get a passport from a brand new country that you weren't born in, that your parents weren't from. All these things are possible now in 2015, and it is seriously exciting because it means that we have much more freedom than we ever had before. Your freedom isn't handed to you from a politician. Your freedom is something that you're born with. Every human being is born free, and it's up to us to decide whether or not we want to realize that. So investing ourselves, investing our time and our energy and our capital in a bankrupt, pointless, trivial political process where you have a bunch of people going around saying exactly the same thing, which is a bunch of lies, and one of them is going to end up in office again after promising the world and then do absolutely nothing. We can choose to invest our time and attention in that, or we can choose to invest our time and attention in the future, in the digital revolution that's coming. And just like the Industrial Revolution, that really fundamentally changed the way that society is organized and improved everybody's freedom and everybody's status and everybody's stature and wealth and opportunity, that's what's happening now. And we can either get out in front of that, or we can stick our heads in the sand and pretend like everything's okay and just expect the government to do all the problem solving for us. That's a crazy idea because it's not going to work. And no matter who you vote for, even if it's Donald Trump, I think the only qualification this guy has is Donald Trump knows when to default. Donald Trump knows when to declare bankruptcy. So in many respects, since I'm not going to get my wish and have a potted plant or a chimpanzee be elected president of the United States, I think that would actually be more beneficial. Because at least they're not going to do anything too stupid. And maybe, just maybe, they might accelerate the decline. Because the country's never going to be able to rebuild until it hits rock bottom. Out of the ashes rises the phoenix. And I think you get to a certain point, past the point of no return, where you're borrowing money just to pay interest, where the totality of your tax revenue can just barely exceed your mandatory social welfare programs and interest on the debt. I mean, you're way past the point of no return. And the United States and most Western European nations, frankly, really just need to become a phoenix now and rise from their own ashes. But the point is that the social contract now, everything is so different. You can be an American or a Belgian or a Canadian or a Brit and not live there anymore. You can go live where you want, and it completely changes your tax obligations. It changes everything. Everything is different now. And I think in the case of Trump, since I'm not going to get the chimpanzee as president of the United States that I'm hoping for, I think Trump can be that chimpanzee. Trump can be truly the chimpanzee that America needs, because he's the only guy who has any experience with what matters most: default. They have $42 trillion in unfunded liabilities. They have $60 trillion total in on-the-books and off-the-books liabilities. And again, when you're looking at collecting, maybe a couple $1 trillion a year in tax revenue, even if you put 100% of your tax revenue into paying down these liabilities, and even if you cap the liabilities, say there's no way these are going to go up. Well, of course they're going to go up. They go up every single year. But even if you cap the liabilities and say, okay, we have $60 trillion in liabilities, it would still take you decades of funneling 100% of your tax revenue into paying these liabilities, which means, by the way, you wouldn't be able to pay any obligations. You'd have no government. You'd have no interest on the debt. You'd have no programs. You'd have nothing except paying off your liabilities for decades and decades. I mean, that's the situation that you're in. So the only advantage that Trump has is this guy knows how to default. This guy knows when to declare bankruptcy, and the United States is bankrupt. All it needs is somebody official to stand up and say, yeah, we're bankrupt. And sorry, China, sorry, Federal Reserve, sorry, taxpayers, sorry, Social Security recipients, we're bankrupt and we just can't afford it. That's a clean slate. That's a phoenix rising from the ashes, which is absolutely necessary. And maybe he's the only person, who actually has the stones to say, yeah, we're bankrupt. The guy's got experience. He's got no problem stiffing his creditors. I doubt he's ever lost a wink of sleep over it. And quite frankly, that's what the United States needs right now, is just to declare bankruptcy. Because the sooner they do it, the sooner they can get it over with, the sooner they can get back to the business of building and rebuilding. That's the only thing that's possible. But in the meantime, look, defaults are never pretty. Defaults always cause huge problems. When the Ottoman Empire defaulted in the 1800s, it caused massive problems for the empire here. When the French defaulted, everybody defaults. Whenever they get into too much trouble, they default. They either default on their creditors or they default on the obligations they owe to their citizens. Somebody is going to get hosed. There's nobody that's going to... The chance of everybody coming out of this unscathed is 0.0%. It is mathematically impossible. And the sooner people wake up and realize that, the better off we'll all be. And you realize that there are better things to invest your time and your energy and your hope and your optimism and your money in than the political process. Spending an iota of any effort into thinking, trying to convince your neighbor to vote for somebody, or thinking that it even matters, or getting caught up in the, in the hope and change and all the nonsense. It's a waste of time. That time's much better spent preparing yourself, investing in yourself. It's the best investment you can ever make. This is what we tell our entrepreneurship students every year. Your best investment is the investment you make in yourself, in knowledge, in education, in building resources, in creating alternatives for yourself, and embracing the digital age, realizing that, again, the world's a big place, and you can go where you want to go now, and you can live exactly how you want to live, earning exactly how you want to earn, investing all over the world, looking around at the opportunities. When you think about it, you could educate yourself and take certain steps to immediately save yourself, 20-25%, and generate an instant 20-25% return simply by reducing your tax revenue. If you're an American and you move overseas, suddenly you're subject to the foreign earned income exclusion, which if you're making $120,000 a year, could easily save you $50,000-$60,000 a year. It's a massive return on investment, because now all of a sudden you're not paying any of that tax. You can look around the world and you can see all kinds of different options. There's a helicopter going by right now. You can see all kinds of different investment options. See, again, a lot of these markets that are trading at their all-time lows. Who is that? Well, that's a little distracting. You can see all these markets trading at their all-time lows. You can see the Turkish lira that's never been this low in its history, the Indonesian rupiah, the South African rand. You can see all these different opportunities out there in Colombia and so forth, that might actually generate substantial return on investment for you instead of being 100% invested in the biggest stock bubble that we've had since the Great Depression. There's so many different options out there, again, that probably command your time and attention much more, and are much better uses of time and attention and energy and resources than the political process. So I just want to encourage you to do that. It always pains me to see people get so caught up in politics. All this stuff is entertainment. It makes front page news all the time. But think of it for what it is. It's entertainment, nothing more. And it doesn't matter if it's Trump or Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush or Joe Biden, or now who are they saying? Al Gore is going to jump in the race now. It just doesn't matter. A chimpanzee could be president of the United States. It's not going to matter. The country would be better off with somebody, frankly, who would just either do absolutely nothing or just do what needs to be done and put government finances out of their misery. That's really what's needed right now. And so I want to encourage you to think about that and encourage you to invest in yourself. Because what's happening right now, because of this digital revolution, what we're seeing right now, just as we've seen in the past, is the rise of the individual. And that's incredibly exciting. It's what makes this, despite all of these problems and all of these challenges and all of this insanity, an incredibly exciting time to be alive. So I want to thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.